Hello out there, all you historians, and welcome to this video explaining the social structure of ancient Egyptian society. In this video, we're going to be unpacking each of the roles and responsibilities of the members on the social pyramid of ancient Egypt. Funnily enough, it does look like a pyramid because the size of the segment in the pyramid represents how many people were members of that social class. So that's why the pharaoh is at the top, not just because they were the most important person in ancient Egyptian society, but because there was only one of them at a time compared to the slaves and servants, which make up the biggest segment of the pyramid because most of society was made up of those people. So let's start off by having a look at the pharaoh. Now, the word pharaoh means great house, and they were worshipped as literal gods. They were believed to be descendants of Horus, who was the son of Osiris and Isis. They had some extremely important jobs, like they were in charge of the changing of the seasons, the flooding of the Nile, and even the movement of the planets. They also had to maintain order in ancient Egyptian society. They had to control the economy, they controlled laws, they waged war, taxes, and oversaw the land in ancient Egypt as well. Some of the famous pharaohs throughout ancient Egypt were Nama, believed to be the first pharaoh, the pharaoh to unite the north and southern kingdoms of Egypt. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, Hatshepsut, Tutmos III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, who was Akhenaten's son, Ptolemy I, who wasn't actually Egyptian, but a general of Alexander the Great, and then Cleopatra, who was the last pharaoh. Now let's have a look at the viziers, the priests, and the nobles. So let's start off by having a look at the vizier. So there was only one vizier at a time, and they were appointed by the pharaoh, and usually it was someone from the royal family because it was someone they had to trust. They were second in authority only to the pharaoh in ancient Egypt, and they oversaw operations and advised the pharaoh on agriculture, executive decisions, laws, the treasury, and war. Imhotep was one of the most famous viziers in ancient Egyptian society. He was born as a peasant but proved himself as a genius, and part of his role being vizier was that he was also a doctor, a nobleman, a chief carpenter, a sculptor, and a builder. Now, the role of the priests, they served the gods' needs in ancient Egyptian society. That during the earlier kingdoms of ancient Egypt, they were appointed by the pharaoh, but by the later kingdoms, the new kingdom, it became a hereditary position. Their main role was to conduct rituals and ceremonies, and religion was such an important part of life in ancient Egypt, so priests were held in high regard, and they oversaw the temple communities they served in. Lastly, we've got the nobles and officials. Nobles were the only people who held official government roles other than the pharaoh and the vizier. Nobles oversaw the regions of ancient Egypt, so the local smaller communities, and they made local laws and maintained order in those communities, and then they owned the farmland as well, as an extension of the pharaoh's ownership of the land in ancient Egypt. Next, we have the scribes. So the scribes are an important part of ancient Egyptian society, and much of the sources we have from ancient Egypt that have lasted and that exist today were made by them. They were made up of people who could obviously read and write, and they wrote in hieroglyphics. Scribes kept records on tax, gifts to the gods, food supplies, minutes from meetings, and the number of soldiers in the Egyptian army. They were also important for religious reasons as well because they wrote the Book of the Dead for people. Now, the Book of the Dead was a bit like an instruction manual on how to get through the afterlife, so you ended up in the Egyptian paradise. Next, we have the skilled artisans and craftsmen. So these people were important in ancient Egyptian society because they made monuments to pharaohs. It's one of the reasons they were important. They were also important for religious reasons because they made items associated with the afterlife. These are things like canopic jars and sarcophaguses. Next, we have the peasant farmers and workers. Now, they were made up of three types of people. They were made up of construction workers, farmers, and paid servants. Construction workers worked on building temples, pyramids, tombs, and monuments. The farmers were important because they made food for the whole empire. They were normally paid in clothing and food. For instance, if you're a farmer, you'd only be growing one thing, so you'd need more than just the thing that you were growing. So you need different types of food to be paid in. And then they lived in like small mud brick houses. Lastly, holding up the whole pyramid, we have the slaves and the servants. So most slaves were forced to work in hard labor. So they did the jobs that no one else wanted to do. They built the grand structures that we associate with ancient Egypt. Most of them were foreigners or captured prisoners of war. So, for instance, the Hittites after the Battle of Kadesh. And then essentially, ancient Egyptian society and progress and success depended on slaves as they were a very, very powerful force to help the empire along. So that is the social structure of ancient Egypt.